Hello, all. For those of you I haven't met yet, I'm Kate Still. I'm the new scientific director of the foundation. I have a PhD in neuroscience and I have experience communicating science to a variety of audiences. So I'm really here to serve you all and to be a resource to you all. And one thing that I know aligns really well with the Planting the Seeds of Tomorrow campaign the foundation is invested in and that you all are invested in is clinical trials. So whether you're new to the foundation or you have questions surrounding clinical trials, I wanted to make a really brief informational video about clinical trials, including how they work and how you can stay informed about upcoming clinical trials. So I will just pull up this PowerPoint really quickly, short PowerPoint I made. Okay. So the first question is, how does a clinical trial in PMS get launched in the first place? And pharmaceutical companies that are developing a drug, sometimes for another reason, such as testing it in an autism population or in other neurodevelopmental disorders, can decide to apply that drug and test it in the PMS population. And one thing that I really wanted to highlight is that you all can be hugely helpful in accelerating this. So recently, data from the International Registry was used by a couple of companies to decide to apply their drug to the PMS population. And we hope that the data hub, which will be launched shortly, will serve a similar purpose, as well as natural history study data can be very important in this process. So we wanted to thank you all for your donations, your time, your traveling, your sharing of your experience with PMS, because that can really matter. A second way that drugs can be applied to the PMS population is if they are existing drugs, which are already FDA approved and then can be applied to PMS. And so this again can be done, initiated largely by the company creating the drug or the group of people testing the drug, or clinicians that are very invested in PMS and recognize that a drug can be applicable to PMS. And finally, I wanted to highlight that the PMSF itself is looking to have a lot more active role in seeking out these opportunities. So we would love to have our finger on the pulse of drugs that seem to be beneficial in other disorders that may have any overlap with PMS and be able to form a relationship with these companies or groups of people that are producing and testing the drug. So clinical trials can be thought of as a late stage of clinical research. So before a drug ever goes to clinical trials, it has to be discovered and studied in the laboratory, sometimes for years or decades. And after it's discovered, it can be tested in animal models. So this is everything from as simple to a fruit fly to a non-human primate. And once these drugs are proven to be safe and effective in these animal models, they can then be tested in humans. And the people making the drug or testing the drug can apply to the FDA to start a phase 1 clinical trial. And phase 1 trials usually have a handful or a low number of people that are either healthy volunteers or people with a disease. And the goal is to detect the safety and dosage of the drug. So is it having a major impact on even healthy people? And you may have noticed that some drugs that seem new to PMS can actually start out in phase 2. And that's because they've already passed this phase 1. Either they've shown that they are safe in another disease or disorder, or they've actually gone all the way to FDA approval. So phase 2 is in a larger group of people, sometimes several hundred people with the disease. And the goal is to test the effectiveness and the side effects, or otherwise called adverse events. And this may not always reach this high of a number in PMS because it is a rare disease, but it is typically a higher number of people than phase 1. If phase 2 is successful and it has an effect and it doesn't have a ton of side effects, it can go on to phase 3, which is a much larger group of people with the disease, and they are monitored long-term for how well the drug works and how many side effects there are. So It's important to note that these phases can last a long time. So the time frame can be months, as in a phase 1 trial, or up to 4 years in a phase 3 trial. So while it is exciting when drugs enter earlier phases of clinical trials, there can still be a significant period of time before a drug is shown to be effective or safe, or that it's going to market. It's also important to know that if you ever are involved in a clinical trial, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will get access to this drug any earlier when it's approved, or if it's approved, or that you can stay on it for any period of time during the testing. So after phase 3, the drug can then go to market. So the group of people making the drug can apply to the FDA, and the FDA then reviews a number of things, including how the drug is being produced, how it's being marketed, and how it's being labeled. And once the FDA approves the drug for market, it can go to market, and then the drug is continually monitored for its impacts on a large group of people. So this will continue for years afterwards, and if there are any serious issues, the drug can be pulled at any time. So again, this can take months to years, even leading up to FDA approval. So some of the terminology associated with clinical trials that you might see are first and foremost exclusion and inclusion criteria. So these are essentially just requirements for participants to either be involved or to not be involved in the study. And for instance, in PMS, this might include something like a specific genetic alteration is allowed to be involved or not, or an age group, or a gender. And you may be wondering, why would somebody ever be excluded from a study? And there are a number of reasons for this. Usually it has to do with the ability to analyze the drug's impact. So for instance, if a group of people is excluded, they may have another disease that could impact the results. They may have another medication that can impact the results. They may be in a group of people that the drug is not supposed to be effective for, but even if a group of people are excluded, it doesn't necessarily mean that a drug would not be beneficial to them in the future if approved. If you ever hear about an arm, it's essentially just a group of people, such as a control group or an experimental group in a clinical trial. Placebo and standard of care are essentially control groups. So a placebo is something that is going to look exactly like the treatment. It can be a pill, it can be a procedure, it could be an injection, but it's not going to be the actual treatment, and it's not known to have a therapeutic effect. So in this case, you're studying what the effect is of just receiving some kind of treatment versus what the effect is of receiving the actual drug. And that's what a placebo group allows the clinicians to do. And sometimes this group will be called standard of care, or they will receive the standard of care. And that is usually a drug that's already approved to treat a condition. So for instance, in a cancer trial, you may have a chemotherapeutic drug that's being tested that's new, but the control group would receive a chemotherapeutic drug that is already approved and is considered the standard of care, so that that group is able to get the best care that's currently available. Anytime anybody is blinded in a study, it means they don't know what's being tested or received. So clinicians and the participants are both blinded in a double-blind study. So neither knows what group of people is getting a control drug versus an experimental drug. And this is to remove any bias where one person, such as a participant, might receive a drug and think I'm feeling better because I got the drug. A crossover study occurs when participants receive different types of treatment. So they can go back and forth between a placebo treatment and an experimental treatment. And finally, in open label, both participants and clinicians know what treatment is being given. And in some cases, with an open label study, everybody can get the experimental drug. So how does a drug get approved in other countries? One of the ways this can happen is clinical trials can actually be done internationally from the outset. So if this occurs once drugs are approved, they can be approved in multiple countries. But more often than not, a clinical trial is done in a specific country and then needs to be approved by regulatory agencies in other countries. So examples of these agencies would be the European Medicines Agency, the US FDA, or the African Medicines Agency. And this process of approval varies significantly because these groups can decide to do their own clinical trials, or they can decide to expedite approval of the drug based off of how it's done in other countries. And this just varies significantly. So how can you find out about current clinical trials and PMS? The best way to do this is to visit clinicaltrials.gov and search for Phelan-McDermid syndrome under a condition. And what this is going to do is it's going to give you a long list of studies that have been either completed or are currently recruiting for clinical trials in PMS. So you might see something like recruiting, enrolling by invitation, meaning they are recruiting but selectively, or it will say not yet recruiting, which means it has been approved but is not yet undergoing the recruitment process. So this is not a comprehensive list, but you will see the comprehensive list if you sign in and look at that. And so I wanted to just briefly break up these drugs into a couple of categories, which is not, all-inclusive, but can be helpful in thinking about what these drugs are doing. And the first thing is that they're generally trying to improve connections between neurons. So in PMS and a lot of other neurodevelopmental disorders, the connection between neurons can be disrupted. They can be overactive or underactive in certain areas, and this can impact cognition. And so one way to impact this is to inject things like growth factors, which can influence neurons and cause them to grow or interact more efficiently with each other. This is the case of a trial ongoing at Mount Sinai right now, and is a similar but not identical idea to what's going on in the upcoming Neuron clinical trial you may have heard of, where the goal of that trial is to actually prevent any of this growth factor from being soaked up in the brain unnecessarily. So there's just more of the growth factor available. There's also the ability to increase chemicals between neurons with things like lithium, which is an ongoing clinical trial in France, and to even dampen down overactive connections between neurons, such as in epilepsy trials associated with PMS. A second major category of current clinical trials in PMS is improvement of metabolism. So all of the cells in our body take in nutrients, process that energy, and use it to function and to carry out their major functions. And so sometimes in PMS and in other disorders, this can be disrupted. And so drugs that alter the metabolism or the cell's ability to use nutrients, such as ubiquinol, that's being tested in Italy right now, can lead to improvements in cognition and other things. So this is not an endorsement of any particular trial. All of these drugs can theoretically impact other things besides neurons, especially if they're being injected into the body. It is really important to stay on top of any studies that come out related to these drugs if they're moving on to another trial before deciding to enroll. So this is not an endorsement. This is just a general overview of the types of drugs that might be available. And in the future, we will continue to provide explanations on new categories or even categories that are a little bit further away in the future, such as gene therapy or gene editing, which may be years down the line, but may be beneficial in PMS. We also want to always educate everyone on drugs that had promise, but haven't seemed to have great benefit, such as oxytocin, which was recently tested, but not shown to have a strong benefit. So once you go to clinicaltrials.gov and you search for Phelan-McDermid syndrome and you check the eligibility and you're eligible for the trial, or your family member or your friend is eligible, you can contact the study organizers at the contact information listed, and you can ask them questions and you can get enrolled. Another easy way to be contacted if you don't want to go to clinicaltrials.gov is through PMSF. So through our membership or the about to be launched data hub, we can actually contact you about upcoming clinical trials. And this is just because we will have, an updated contact list, and this is a way for us to reach you. But indirectly, you can also be updated about clinical trial news on the website, and the newsletter, and on social media. So we will continue to put out information about specific drugs, about categories of drugs, about new clinical trials for you all. So I hope this was helpful. This is the end of the presentation, and I hope to be doing another of these relatively soon and seeing some of you in the future. So thank you.